This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, and fun fact, 98% of all German Shepherds are dogs. My co-host is John Pasden, and he's upset because for the first 14 billion years of this universe, electricity was free. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner joining you from the United States here in Utah.
Hey everybody, my name is John Pasden. I am in Shanghai, China, getting ready to start my summer.
All right, John, you're in Shanghai, but not for long.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to visit family in the U.S., so I'm looking forward to that.
Funny enough, I'm going to be heading to China. By the time this episode is live, I should be there.
Yeah, it's like you were waiting for me to be gone to make a little visit, huh, Jared?
Yeah, it's like, hey, John, when are you going back to the States? All right, I'll come there.
Yeah, good job. So I won't see you in China.
That's right, but I'm going to be heading over there for a trip with my two oldest boys. They're going to be part of like a study trip, and so I'm really looking forward to that. It's first time back in 4 years.
Wow. Well, you'll notice that Shanghai is pretty different.
Well, I know. Last time gone for 3 months, I come back is pretty different, but heck, this time it's a whole pandemic. I missed out on that, so here we go.
All right. Well, shall we get into today's topic?
Absolutely. And I think today's topic is something I know more about than probably anyone else on the planet.
Why is that?
It's about the Dunning-Kruger effect. Dun-ching. No, okay.
All right, you're going to have to explain that one, Jared.
All right, John, I'm going to explain it. Well, it's a cognitive bias, and it's essentially when you're really overestimating your knowledge, skills, or ability in something. So it's when you think you know a lot about something, but you actually know just a little bit, and it seems like it's correlated, like the less you know, like the more confident certain people are about what they think they know.
Yeah, it's not like the less you know, but it's when you know a certain amount that isn't really that much, but it's enough for you to feel like you've learned quite a bit. Like if you've heard that saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Yeah, like once you get to the point where you feel like you've learned quite a bit, but you're actually just at the beginning of your journey, that's when the Dunning-Kruger effect can take effect and have you overestimating your mastery, overestimating your abilities in whatever it is.
And there we go. We just demonstrated my expertise on this subject. So how does this relate to language learning then?
All right, so this can relate to anything you're learning, and language learning is just one example of that. So I feel like I've seen this a lot over the years. I've noticed it in myself and my own learning when I'm reflective about my learning. I've noticed it in other learners and even in people that I've helped as clients through All-Set Learning. And so I wanted to identify 3 main areas where I've definitely seen it rear its ugly head. And those are related to pinyin, tones, and fluency in general.
I'll say this, John, is that I think this actual, effect, this Dunning-Kruger effect, it's quite pervasive in all language learning. There's a number of, comments and discussions about this, different forums and stuff about this very topic. But I don't know, just my opinion. I think it's a little bit more pervasive, perhaps in Chinese. And it's perhaps because of how encouraging native speakers are when they're like, oh, you say ni hao, and they're like, oh, your Chinese is so good. There's so much, I guess, overt praise that kind of fuels sometimes a bit of that perception in Chinese.
I agree that it's like exaggerated in Chinese. And this is one reason why I wanted to talk about it related to Chinese. But the reason I think that is because Chinese has these steep learning curve in the beginning. And if you can get over those first maybe 2 challenges, you feel like you've made it, but really you've made it through the first hurdle. And so I think those first 2 major hurdles are pinyin and tones.
And before we jump into that, John, this reminds me of a joke someone had once told me when I was starting to learn Chinese. They said the 4 stages of learning Chinese. 1, you know nothing. Stage 2, you think you know everything. 3, you're afraid you'll never know anything. And then stage 4, you realize you know just a little bit.
Yeah, so actually I've heard that too. And that relates to the Dunning-Kruger effect. The think you know everything stage is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Actually, before I get into this, let me share a quote by David Moser. He's a professor related to Chinese language and culture. We've had him on the show way back in the day.
It's a podcast number 8.
Right. And he has said, the old saying I heard when I first started learning Chinese was, learning Chinese is a 5-year lesson in humility. At the time, I assumed that the point of this aphorism was that after 5 years, you will have mastered the humility along with the Chinese. After I put in my 5 years, however, I realized the sad truth. I had mastered humility all right, but my Chinese still had a long way to go, and still does.
Amen.
All right. So, we're not learning Chinese because it's easy. Don't let this discourage you, but let's get into some of the specifics. So first, related to pinyin. So I think the hurdle I was talking about, what makes the learning curve steeper for pinyin is that there are these sounds that don't exist in other languages. So it's not like Spanish or like Japanese where, it sounds a little foreign, but you master these sounds and then you're basically just perfecting it after that. And native speakers can understand you pretty early on. Like when it comes to Chinese, you're trying to read the pinyin, maybe you've studied it for a few hours, people still can't understand you, right? So once you start to make progress with the X, the Q, and the J, the R, the YU sound, you feel like you're doing really well. And then once you get a bit better with that, you might be like, okay, I've mastered the sounds.
I'm thinking, John, on a number of learners I know, and some say that, oh, yeah, my Chinese, I'm still learning, but my pronunciation is really good. I've heard that quite a bit. And I think it's because of this exact dynamic that you're talking about.
Or because their teacher is super encouraging. That does happen too, right?
And sometimes, I've heard their pronunciation. I'm like, okay, that's actually not bad for the level that they're at. But usually, yeah, it's not quite as good as they seem to think it is.
So just keep in mind that, pronunciation with Chinese is tough. It's going to take a while to master the sounds of pinyin, and then it's going to take a while to really get quite automatic about correct pronunciation. It takes a while. Okay, so moving on to tones. Tones are something that I've worked with a lot over the years, and I've identified different stages of tone mastery. And I feel like with tones, one thing that happens with a lot of learners is in the very beginning, they don't get them at all. It takes them a while to start hearing them and to start being able to produce them with any kind of accuracy. And then once they get to the single tone accuracy stage, like they can hear a fourth tone, they can make a fourth tone. They can hear a third tone, they can make a third tone. Once they can do that, they're kind of like, I'm there, I did it. I've learned tones. But the thing is, once you string these tones together, until you get really good at it, they kind of just fall apart at first, right? So being able to correctly create a first tone with your own mouth, that is an achievement, but that's milestone 1, right? And so there are some learners that think that they've made it because they achieved the first milestone. And it is a milestone worthy of celebration. Don't get me wrong.
Yay!
But you're not quite at the end of the race yet.
John, I think this whole aspect of tones, there's an analogy that comes to mind, almost like playing a brass instrument. If you like the trumpet, it just only has 3 valves to control the note, but you move your mouth as you're playing it. And so you can master one of these notes, but it's a whole different thing, like you said, to string all those together. And so I think what you're describing is a little bit like, hey, you're able to hit a note. You're able to master that note, but now you put them all together, and tones is no different. And I think, John, I remember that forever ago, one of the articles I had read on Sinosplice, it was about your thesis that you had done, I think, for grad school. And it was about these tone pair combinations. And what was revelatory to me was the hardest tone pair combination was the third, second tone. And that's like Meiguo, that whole thing. And it made me sense why I could never, or I thought I was saying it right, but then I realized, no, I wasn't saying it.
Yeah. So if you've gotten to this point where you can pretty reliably make single tones in isolation, then the next stage is tone pairs. And that takes a while too, but it's fun. Don't worry.
Yeah. And then it's stringing a whole sentence together with getting all those tones right.
Yeah, because once you can do any pair, then you can essentially chain all tones together, right? Because you can just break them down into a bunch of pairs.
Hypothetically, right? But it takes a little practice, right?
Easier said than done, you might say.
Yes, which is essentially why I think we a little bit overstate some of that. But it's easy to overestimate that ability. Okay, nailed the tone, and now, I got tones. Tones are no problem, right?
Yeah, it does take a bit of time. Okay, so that brings us to the third element that I wanted to talk about, and that is fluency.
Ooh, the F word, John.
Yeah, you might think, oh, well, Chinese is so hard. I know I'm not fluent. How could I ever think that I'm totally fluent? Well, this is one that I myself experienced. I remember after I had lived in China for about 3 years, and or maybe 2.5, and I was feeling quite comfortable speaking Chinese. And I was planning to take the HSK, planning to move to Shanghai, starting to make plans to do graduate school studies in Shanghai. And I just got this overinflated sense of my ability because everyone I talked to, they weren't talking about, politics and government policy. They were just talking about everyday stuff. And I had kind of gotten that down. And I think it partly was taking the HSK and HSK prep courses that made me realize, oh, wait, there's actually a lot of grammar that I've never seen. Oh, wait, I'm not actually reading that much. Therefore, I'm not coming across a lot of the vocabulary and a lot of the grammar patterns and the formal types of language that I need in order to not only improve, but to be able to do a master's in Chinese.
So, John, are you pretty much talking about maybe overestimating your overall level of fluency or your competency in the language?
Yeah, because I wasn't putting myself in situations where I really needed a higher level of vocabulary and I needed more grammar types and higher levels of formality. So I was definitely like in this comfortable area. So I had to get out of my comfort zone in order to really improve my Chinese and get it to the next level.
I think this is a great example, John, about how many people can get stuck in this area. And I think, your example, it's a little bit more, I don't know, like to even do what you were doing, you had to have at least a level of fluency, right? But I think if we look back also, there's some individuals that they may go through like a Chinese course in some sort of school or program, and they've graduated on or gone through, these textbook chapters, and now they are at a quote unquote intermediate level, or they're in now an advanced class or something. And so the perception can be sometimes that, oh, because they say I'm at this level of class and I'm passing, I'm getting good marks or grades, therefore I have a high, I wouldn't say high, but a level of fluency that is perhaps higher than it actually is. And what I have definitely seen is that there's a big difference between practicing language in a very controlled environment in a classroom versus actually experiencing the language out in the wild. And that can be a pretty humbling experience at times.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, I think I've experienced that too. I've probably experienced the Dunning-Kruger effect over and over again in my studies over the years. Like I remember when I studied Chinese as a university student, I studied for 3 semesters and I made it through 2 years of college level Chinese. We used a integrated Chinese, what was that, 2nd edition? I don't know. It was, one of these textbooks that's now old. And I was like, okay, my Chinese isn't amazing, but I'm going to be able to get by. I've got the basics. And so I was pretty shocked when I couldn't even communicate about basic things a lot of the time because I'd just never been in the environment. I'd only been in an academic environment.
And sometimes we can get caught up in this concept of thinking, okay, I may be at an intermediate level or I'm in advanced classes, but there are some times where you may feel really hesitant to go out there and actually use the language with natives because you're afraid to have it tested or tried or proved, and to sometimes it may burst your bubble on that self-perception of what you think your language is. I have seen in some individuals be very reluctant to do that, to go out there and really try it because they don't want to lose sometimes that image that they have in their mind of, of how good their Chinese might be. And so that's a little bit of this concept of having like a fixed mindset. There's definitely these dynamics of kids who are told that they're smart from, young age and always told they're smart. Well, they always choose the easiest path so they never fail and don't look dumb right in front of people. So, there can be that dynamic as well. I'm sure that's a cognitive bias there, John. I'm not sure exactly what the one that is, but that plays out, I think, in all of our lives at some point.
Yeah, you're trying to protect your own, I guess you could say it's related to your self-worth, but your efforts. You don't want to think that maybe your efforts didn't get you as far as you hoped they had. And I think that's what I attribute my success with pronunciation to, is I was totally willing to go back and be, well, I won't say totally willing, but in the end, I was willing to be like, okay, am I pronouncing anything right? What am I pronouncing wrong? Because I know it's not nothing. And, I had to really take a look at the XQJ sounds because I had been approximating them and getting by in class, but it wasn't quite right. And, my R wasn't right. And my U sound wasn't right, the YU sound, the U with the umlaut. And of course, my tones weren't good either. And that willingness to just do the work and to, go back to the basics and then build back up, that's what ultimately made a big difference.
John, it's interesting to talk about this because I'm reflecting a little bit on my experience of learning Chinese. I always say I learned Chinese on the streets of Shanghai. So I was always in the wild. I was never in a classroom environment. I never had a tutor till I think I was in 6 or 7 years of learning the language. And so I always had this constant feeling of my Chinese has just never been good enough. And it's still not, of course, but it's just never been good enough. It's just, I would say, no, it's been good enough to like function or do, what I want to do. And there's things I've been definitely more comfortable in, but it was never this thing of like, oh, I always thought my Chinese was way better than it was. There's definitely, okay, I'm sure I've definitely fallen, victim to this. I know when I was very, very beginning learning, but yeah, Chinese for me has been that constant lesson in humility. Not that I'm the most humble guy. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. So I think this leads to a natural question. It's like, okay, well, the Dunning-Kruger effect is real. It's well documented. It has special applications to learning Chinese. So then what do we do about that?
Yeah. So you think your Chinese is better than it really is. Well, how do we challenge that? I'm not sure how to answer that, John. What would you say in all of your experience working with many different learners?
Well, I think the first thing is to know what to expect. I mean, if you just know, I need to learn pinyin, I need to learn tones, and then you learn the 4 tones in isolation, you might think that you did the first step because you don't really know what the whole process is like. But if you know that learning tones is a series of steps and the first step is learning the 4 tones in isolation, then you're going to have more realistic expectations because you know that there's more coming in order to get your tones really good. And similarly, when you're learning pinyin, if you're learning from some resource that kind of tricks you, like, oh, the Q is like CH, but it doesn't explain why there's a Q and a CH. Like, if they're the same sound, why are they written differently? Like, they're not the same sound. So some phrase books will give you approximations, but what you want is to get it really right and to learn it right if you're learning Chinese for the long haul. So again, getting the expectations right about pinyin, like you do have to learn some sounds that don't exist in English. And it's very possible. Many people do it, but it's not super easy.
John, I like that quote you brought up earlier from David Moser talking about first 5 years in Chinese of being a lesson in humility. And in my opinion, I really think that is probably the most critical thing here in overcoming, I guess, this Dunning-Kruger effect, but not just that, but in language learning in general, is that anyone learning a language is that you're putting yourself out there because you are trying to actually use something that you don't know how to use well. And that's going to happen with anything that you're learning. But that is part of the learning process, perhaps even more so in language learning. And on top of that, even more so in Chinese language learning. You are going to be embarrassed at some point, or you're going to maybe say something embarrassing. You're going to say something wrong. And so I think one of the biggest things that will help anyone to try to overcome some of these things is just accept that you are going to say something wrong. You accept that at some point you're going to say something that's going to might make you look dumb, and you can't avoid that unless you want to be in an environment where you're totally protected. And in that type of environment, you're not really going to make a lot of progress in learning that you would otherwise.
Yeah, totally agree. Humility is important. But one other thing is related to learning with a teacher. Of course, you need a teacher that's encouraging and positive. Yes. But if your teacher is only positive and never points out some of the issues that still exist, then how are you going to get better, right? If your teacher never corrects you, how are you going to realize that you're still actually even making mistakes? So I think having a teacher which helps you continually improve is really important. I know there are a lot of teachers that kind of just are 100% positive all the time, which seems nice. But like, for example, at All Set Learning, our teachers that do the online classes, they're trained to be both positive and constructive with a little bit of criticism so that you can continue to make improvements.
And that's been helpful for me. I think, John, there's a number of some issues I have that are fossilized in Chinese, but I've been slowly breaking out of some of those with tutors who have helped me say, hey, you're doing this again. I'm like, oh, yeah, let me try again, And so that's helpful. And I think if we really want to improve our language abilities, then we have to be open and willing to that, open and willing to accept that type of correction. And one of the things also I think about in this, John, is that what are your language goals? Is the goal of the language to be able to just say, I speak Chinese, and just be able to say you do it or speak it and try to impress someone who doesn't speak Chinese or something? Or do you really want to use it as a tool to communicate? If you really do want to use it as a tool to communicate and it's something you really are interested and passionate about, then absolutely you need to be able to accept that correction and be able to improve upon your mistakes that you're making.
Totally. And one other thing, like if you feel like your Chinese has really arrived and you really want to put it to the test, I find one of the best ways is to just make a phone call. So if you can do a phone call in Chinese and the other person doesn't know that you're Chinese, preferably more than like 1 or 2 sentences of a phone call, right? Then that is a more objective way to assess your communicative ability.
And on top of that as well, just like you brought up when you're talking about your story of learning, John, is that there are going to be some areas, subject matters, domains that you are going to be quote unquote fluent in, that you're going to be able to communicate very competently and you're going to feel very good about. Well, then there's going to be other things that you just don't know much about, and you're going to have a very difficult time talking about it or using some unique words or phrases or whatever to communicate and convey those ideas. And of course, if we need to have a discussion about particle physics, John, that is something I don't know much about. So I'm going to have a hard time really having any sort of discussion there. But the same thing is going to apply in Chinese.
All right. So I hope this is useful. It's not meant to be discouraging. All the reasons and all the wonderful benefits of learning Chinese are still there. But if you find yourself maybe getting a little too cocky, remember the Dunning-Kruger effect, and hopefully these tips are helpful for you.
So, John, what do you know more about than anyone else in the world?
Jared, don't bait me. I've learned humility.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. My name is Jared Turner, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, and Sinosplice.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. Take a moment to text or message this episode to a friend or share it on social media. It really helps us to reach more people on their language journey. You can leave us a review on iTunes or reach out to us at mandarincompanion.com or find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can find our Chinese Graded Reader Series on Amazon, iBooks, Google Play, or wherever you find your books. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is Jasper Chua. And special thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.